October 25, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Dawn breaks in streaks of gray over a restless ocean. On the bridge of the Japanese battleship Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita peers through his binoculars. His fleet, the most powerful surface armada Japan has ever assembled, cuts through the swells toward Leyte Gulf. Suddenly, distant dots appear on the horizon. Tiny shapes, aircraft, dozens of them, rising from small ships that shouldn't even be there. Impossible, one officer mutters. Fleet carriers? Here? But they aren't fleet carriers. They're smaller, slower, and yet they're launching planes just as fast. In moments, the sky fills with Grumman Wildcats and Avenger torpedo bombers, diving fearlessly into the heart of the Japanese line. Kurita watches as explosions bloom across his escorts. Smoke, confusion, radio chaos. He had expected to crush a helpless American convoy. Instead, his warships are being attacked by floating airstrips, little carriers the Americans had built by the dozens. The admiral lowers his binoculars slowly. The arrogance of Japan's naval command fades into disbelief. Because on that morning, the Imperial Navy finally understood. America had turned its factories into shipyards of the sky, and even its smallest carriers could change the fate of the Pacific. In the early years of World War II, Japan ruled the Pacific. Its carriers struck with precision, its navy operated like clockwork, and its admirals believed they understood every aspect of sea warfare. The Japanese doctrine was simple. Power rested in capital ships, mighty battleships, and full-sized carriers. Anything smaller was considered insignificant, a mere support vessel. But across the ocean, the United States had learned a brutal lesson at Pearl Harbor. America's naval command realized that war in the Pacific wouldn't be won by battleships, it would be won by air power and endurance. So while Japan perfected its elite fleet carriers, America quietly began building something different: escort carriers. They were slower, smaller, and far cheaper to produce. Ships converted from merchant hulls or built rapidly on assembly lines. They could carry around 30 planes instead of 90, and their decks were barely half the size of a standard carrier. To Japan's admirals, they looked like little more than floating targets. But to American strategists, they were the perfect answer to an impossible problem: how to project air power everywhere at once. By 1943, the U.S. Navy's production lines were turning out escort carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Each new hull meant new air cover for convoys, new strikes against submarines, and new hope for island landings. They became known as jeep carriers or baby flat tops. Humble, but deadly. And as the Pacific campaign advanced toward the Philippines, these tiny ships would soon face the ultimate test when Japan sent its most powerful armada to destroy them. None of the Japanese commanders could have imagined that these little floating airstrips would stand in the way of their empire's last gamble. By mid-1943, the balance of naval warfare was shifting, quietly but decisively. While Japan's great fleet carriers like Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho carried prestige and raw power, the United States had unleashed a different kind of force: numbers. Where Japan could build one large carrier in a year, the Americans could build 6 or 7 escort carriers in the same time, often faster. The new Casablanca-class escort carriers rolled off production lines at Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards in a rhythm that mirrored Detroit's automobile factories. Each ship was assembled like a machine, prefabricated sections, welded, launched, and sent to sea, sometimes in less than 4 months. Their purpose was not to duel Japan's fleet. Their mission was everywhere else. They guarded convoys across the Atlantic, supplied island landings in the Pacific, hunted submarines, and carried replacement aircraft for damaged carriers. To Japan's admirals, these ships seemed unworthy of attention. They didn't have heavy armor, and their top speed barely touched 19 knots, too slow to operate with the fast carrier task forces. Their air groups were small, a handful of Wildcats and Avengers. In Japanese intelligence briefings, they were considered support vessels, not combatants. But while Japan dismissed them, the U.S. Navy quietly changed its tactics. Each escort carrier was accompanied by destroyers and destroyer escorts, forming task units that could cover vast ocean spaces. Their aircraft flew endless patrols, sinking submarines, scouting for enemy fleets, and bombing isolated outposts. By late 1943, in battles like the invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, these small carriers proved indispensable. They provided continuous close air support, something the large fleet carriers couldn't do while staying mobile and out of range. Each landing force had its own floating airfield, always nearby, always launching, and that constant air umbrella allowed U.S. Marines to fight, dig in, and advance with unprecedented coordination. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy took notice, but too late. Reports trickled in from surviving submarines. Small American carriers are everywhere. Even as Japanese pilots searched for the great fleet carriers, they kept finding these new ships popping up along the horizon, seemingly endless in number. The Japanese Naval Intelligence Bureau initially believed the reports were exaggerated. Admiral Toyoda and his staff thought the Americans had perhaps a dozen of these vessels. In truth, by the end of 1943, the U.S. already had more than 50 escort carriers at sea, with dozens more under construction. To Japan's industry, strangled by lack of steel and oil, such numbers were impossible. To America's wartime factories, it was simply another week's work. And so, as the Pacific tide rolled toward the Philippines in 1944, the stage was set for one of the most incredible moments in naval history. A handful of these baby carriers, slow, thinly armored, and lightly armed, would soon find themselves face to face with the largest Japanese fleet ever assembled since Pearl Harbor. It would happen off the coast of Samar during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when Japan made its final desperate attempt to crush the American invasion. The Japanese commanders believed they were about to annihilate a group of helpless escort carriers, but what followed would shock them and rewrite the understanding of naval air power forever. Industrial might, factories at sea. No weapon in the American arsenal better reflected the country's industrial soul than the escort carrier. Each one was a symbol of how the United States could take an ordinary commercial hull, an oil tanker or cargo ship, and transform it into an aircraft carrier in a matter of weeks. The Casablanca class was the pinnacle of this concept. It measured just 512 feet in length, half that of Japan's massive Shinano or Zukaku, and displaced only 8,000 tons, yet its flight deck, elevators, and catapults could handle a full complement of fighters and torpedo bombers. At Henry Kaiser's shipyards in Vancouver and Tacoma, these ships were built using assembly line methods inspired by Ford's automobile plants. Prefabricated sections were welded together by teams working around the clock. A single vessel could be launched every 50 days. By contrast, Japan's Taiho took nearly 2 years to complete. This staggering efficiency meant America could afford to lose carriers and still keep advancing. If one was sunk, 2 more were already being fitted out. To Japan, it was inconceivable. Their naval culture prized craftsmanship, precision, and tradition, not speed. They built warships like works of art. America built them like tools of necessity. And in modern war, it was the latter that proved unstoppable. By 1944, America had built over 120 escort carriers, more than the total number of carriers, battleships, and cruisers Japan had combined. They were floating proof that industry could win wars as surely as guns or planes. Tactical innovation. Air power for every battle. Escort carriers changed how America fought. Until their arrival, naval air power was concentrated in a few large task forces, powerful but inflexible. The smaller carriers made air support local, continuous, and personal. At Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan, Marines fought just a few miles from the beaches, while baby flat tops orbited offshore, launching aircraft that could strike, circle back, refuel, and return within minutes. Each escort carrier operated as the heartbeat of a mini task force, flanked by destroyers and supply ships. Together, they formed what sailors called taffy units. Unlike the great fleet carriers that moved fast and struck deep, the escort groups lingered, providing protection for convoys, covering amphibious landings, and hunting submarines that lurked beneath the surface. In doing so, they reshaped the rhythm of naval warfare. Every assault, every island chain, every convoy now had its own floating airfield. The Pacific became a patchwork of American-controlled skies, not because of the big carriers, but because of hundreds of small ones constantly patrolling the sea lanes. This tactical innovation broke the Japanese hold on mobility. Their submarines, once terrorizing supply lines, found themselves hunted from above. Their island garrisons, once unreachable, were bombed daily. The ocean, once Japan's domain, had turned hostile. Technological simplicity, the power of good enough. The escort carrier was not glamorous. It was noisy, slow, and unstable in rough seas. Pilots often called them rolling decks of death. Yet the technology behind them was a masterclass in practicality. Each ship carried just enough capability: one catapult, two elevators, and a small island superstructure. Its flight deck was made of steel instead of teak, reducing weight and time to build. Their aircraft, Grumman FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, were rugged, reliable, and designed for short-deck operations. The Avengers could carry torpedoes, depth charges, or bombs, switching from anti-submarine to ground attack roles in minutes. Everything about the escort carrier was built around function over perfection. And it was this philosophy that Japan never adopted. Where Japanese engineers built masterpieces like the Yamato, a battleship so advanced it was practically a monument, America built hundreds of smaller, simpler, cheaper ships that could operate anywhere. When combined, these modest vessels had a far greater effect than a single superweapon. It was the triumph of quantity and strategy over pride and tradition. The human element. Courage on fragile decks. Life aboard an escort carrier was unlike anything else in the U.S. Navy. They lacked the space and luxury of the great fleet carriers. Their decks were narrow, their hangars cramped, and their living quarters constantly vibrating from the roar of engines. Sailors described the Casablanca class as a ship that never stopped moving. Even in calm seas, their flat-bottomed hulls rolled unpredictably, enough to make aircraft slide, crash, or tip overboard during rough takeoffs. Yet morale was unshakable. Most of the men aboard were reservists, not career sailors. Many had come from civilian life, machinists, students, mechanics, learning naval discipline as they learned the sea itself. They worked in endless cycles of launching and recovering aircraft, refueling, rearming, and repairing damaged planes, often under fire. There was no armor to protect them. One bomb or torpedo could tear the entire ship apart. But they kept going. In the words of one crewman from the USS Fanshawe Bay, "We knew we weren't the biggest ships or the fastest, but our planes were up there every hour. That was our shield." For every pilot taking off from a deck barely 500 feet long, there was the constant risk of disaster, overshooting into the sea or stalling on launch. And still they flew, wave after wave, day after day. The escort carrier crews represented America's quiet resilience, not glory-seeking warriors, but determined men who turned fragile ships into floating fortresses through sheer grit. The enemy's perspective. Japanese shock and disbelief. For Japanese commanders, the appearance of America's escort carriers was deeply unsettling. When reconnaissance aircraft first spotted these small ships scattered across vast ocean sectors, reports described them as merchant conversions. Tokyo's admirals assumed they posed little threat. But by late 1944, Japanese pilots were reporting a nightmare. The skies above every convoy, every invasion beach, every retreat path were filled with American aircraft, dozens of them, striking from what appeared to be endless sources. At first, the Imperial Navy believed these were detached units from the fast carrier groups. Only when captured intelligence revealed that many of these ships were escort carriers did the scale of the revelation sink in. America hadn't just built more carriers, it had built an entire new class of naval warfare. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the powerful center force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was among those who dismissed them. He believed his heavy cruisers and battleships would annihilate any small carrier force they encountered. But when his fleet finally clashed with Task Unit 77.4.3, a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, the result would shock him and every observer of the war. The Japanese commanders learned too late that the baby flat tops were never alone. Their planes and destroyer escorts fought with such ferocity that Kurita believed he was facing a full carrier group. By the time he realized the truth, his opportunity had vanished. That disbelief, that underestimation, marked the beginning of the end for Japan's naval doctrine. Strategic psychology, redefining naval power. The escort carrier didn't just fill a gap in the U.S. Navy, it redefined what naval power meant. Before the war, sea dominance meant big ships, battleships and carriers with massive firepower. After 1944, it meant coverage. Who could control more ocean? Who could put more planes in the sky, more often, in more places? By that measure, the escort carrier was unmatched. They blurred the line between offensive and defensive warfare. They could guard, strike, resupply, and evacuate, all without the need for a major fleet base. It was mobility on a scale the Japanese Empire had never imagined possible. Even within the U.S. Navy, the psychological shift was enormous. Officers who once dreamed of commanding battleships now realized the future belonged to the air deck, even a small one. And after the war, the same philosophy would evolve into the helicopter carrier and modern amphibious assault ship. Japan's admirals looked down on the escort carrier, but history would prove that these floating airstrips were the most efficient symbol of total war, where production, adaptability, and perseverance outweighed prestige, armor, and pride. By late 1944, this transformation would reach its defining test, when the Japanese Navy, desperate to stop the American invasion of the Philippines, unleashed its mightiest force against a handful of these small ships. It would become one of the most astonishing upsets in naval history. October 25, 1944. The waters east of the Philippines. The morning was cloaked in mist, the sea calm, the horizon empty. Aboard 6 small American escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, known by their radio call sign Taffy 3, life seemed almost routine. The men aboard the USS Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalenin Bay, Kitkun Bay, St. Lo, and Gambier Bay believed the Japanese surface fleet had been shattered days earlier. Their mission was to support the landings at Leyte, launching aircraft to bomb inland positions and provide cover for U.S. troops. Their crews were weary but confident. They had no radar contacts, no sign of enemy ships, just a quiet dawn and the hum of engines. Then, at 06:45 hours, the calm shattered. Lookouts on Fanshawe Bay spotted dark shapes emerging from the haze, first one, then many. Within minutes, they realized the unthinkable. An entire Japanese battle fleet was bearing down on them. At its head was Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, more than 20 major warships in total. Their guns were enormous, 18-inch and 8-inch shells that could tear an escort carrier apart with a single hit. And now, those guns were turning toward Taffy 3. Commander Clifton Sprague, in charge of the small task unit, realized the impossible odds within seconds. His ships had no armor. Their top speed was barely half that of the Japanese cruisers. They had no hope of outrunning or outgunning the enemy. His only option was survival, to fight, delay, and somehow protect the invasion forces behind them. Sprague's voice came over the radio. "Open fire with everything you have. Launch all planes. Make smoke." The decks of the escort carriers roared to life. Pilots scrambled from their bunks, rushing to their aircraft. Many had no time to load full bomb loads. They armed whatever they could: depth charges, machine guns, even empty fuel tanks, anything that could inflict damage or confusion. Within minutes, waves of FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers clawed into the sky, forming a thin line of defense against the overwhelming fleet below. From the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita watched in astonishment as dozens of aircraft rose from the tiny decks, circling and diving through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. At first, he believed he had stumbled upon a powerful U.S. carrier task force. The intensity of the aircraft attacks, the coordination of the destroyers, and the volume of return fire all suggested something far larger than it was. Kurita's fleet opened fire. The sea erupted with steel and flame. The escort carriers maneuvered desperately, weaving, zigzagging, disappearing behind smoke screens laid by their destroyer escorts. Shells landed all around them. At 7:10 hours, Gambier Bay took several direct hits, her thin hull torn open by 8-inch shells. She slowed, listing, but her aircraft continued launching until the deck was awash with water. Nearby, the destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans, turned toward the enemy. It was a suicidal move, but Evans refused to retreat. He led a torpedo run straight at a column of Japanese cruisers, firing his last rounds as he charged through incoming fire. His attack crippled one cruiser and forced others to turn away. From the air, American pilots struck with everything they had. Even unarmed, they made repeated dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners. The sky was filled with smoke trails and burning ships. Kurita's radio operator sent frantic messages: "Under heavy air attack, many carriers." He was fighting ghosts, an illusion of strength created by a handful of slow escort carriers and a few heroic destroyers. As the morning wore on, chaos spread through the Japanese formation. Cruisers collided while dodging torpedoes. Battleships turned in confusion, fearing heavy carrier reinforcements. By 9:30 hours, the situation had reversed. Taffy 3 was battered, but still alive. Kurita's mighty fleet, one that should have annihilated them within minutes, was withdrawing. The escort carriers had achieved the impossible. They had bluffed the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent to sea. And yet, this was only half the story. The battle was not over. What happened next, the final phase of the fight off Samar, would seal the legend of the escort carriers forever. By 09:30 hours on October 25, 1944, the sea east of Samar was a vision of chaos. Columns of smoke reached for the sky. Burning oil slicks drifted across the water. Half-sunk ships, American and Japanese alike, dotted the horizon. And yet, amid the carnage, Taffy 3 still fought on. The destroyers Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts, each no larger than a light cruiser's turret, had charged directly at the Japanese fleet. Their torpedoes and gunfire had created the illusion of a much larger American force. Most of these destroyers were now gone, their crews scattered in the water, their hulls shattered. but their sacrifice had bought precious time for the carriers. Aboard the surviving escort carriers, the flight decks were slick with fuel and blood. Crews worked feverishly to keep damaged planes airborne, refueling and rearming under fire. Pilots returned again and again, often with no ammunition left, making low passes to draw Japanese fire away from the carriers. From the flagship, Fanshawe Bay, Commander Clifton Sprague refused to believe what he was witnessing. The largest battleships in the world, including Yamato and Nagato, were now turning away. At first, no one could believe it. Reports from American aircraft confirmed it again and again. Korea's Great Armada was reversing course. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled was retreating from a handful of escort carriers and their screen of destroyers. For the Japanese, confusion reigned. Admiral Kurita had received conflicting reports. His ships claimed they were under heavy carrier attack, that torpedo bombers were approaching from multiple directions, that enemy reinforcements were imminent. His lookouts counted dozens of aircraft circling overhead, far more than any escort carrier could launch. In truth, there were only 6 small carriers and roughly 450 men left fighting on deck. But perception, not power, ruled that morning. At 0950 hours, Kurita made the decision. He ordered his fleet to withdraw northward, away from Leyte Gulf. It was an act of disbelief as much as caution. To him, no rational commander would have risked so small a force alone. Therefore, he assumed something far larger was nearby. In Tokyo, when word arrived that Kurita had turned back, the Naval General Staff fell into stunned silence. The opportunity to crush the American invasion fleet, to perhaps turn the tide of the entire war, had vanished. But the cost for Taffy 3 was staggering. At 1,000 hours, Japanese aircraft, flying from distant bases, launched a final wave of kamikaze attacks. One of the escort carriers, the USS St. Lo, was struck squarely by a dive-bombing Zero. Its 250-pound bomb detonated deep inside the hangar deck. Within minutes, secondary explosions from fueled aircraft tore through the ship. The crew fought the flames desperately, but it was hopeless. At 11 o'clock hours, St. Lo's magazines erupted in a final explosion, a towering fireball that lifted the flight deck clear off the hull. She became the first major U.S. warship sunk by a kamikaze attack. Survivors clung to wreckage as their ships slipped beneath the waves. Nearby, Kalinin Bay and White Plains still launched aircraft, battered, scorched, but alive. The sea was now littered with lifeboats and oil fires. Wounded sailors drifted for hours, watching burning ships fade into the distance. Many recalled hearing faint cheers as word spread that Kurita's fleet had withdrawn. Against impossible odds, the smallest ships in the U.S. Navy had defeated the largest fleet Japan had ever sent to sea. When word of the battle reached Admiral William Halsey, he called it the most remarkable of the war. Other commanders could hardly believe it. The reports sounded like legend. Destroyers charging battleships, unarmored carriers surviving direct hits, and Japanese battleships retreating from a handful of pilots with half-empty fuel tanks. In truth, it was all real. The battle off Samar became one of the most inspiring and astonishing episodes in naval history. A victory born not of firepower or armor, but of courage, deception, and willpower. But the victory came at a heavy cost. Hundreds of American sailors were dead or missing. 6 ships lay beneath the waves, and Japan's dream of regaining control of the Pacific had ended that morning not in a grand duel of fleets, but in the humiliation of retreat from a group of baby flat-tops. Next came the reckoning, the aftermath of Samar. How the world reacted, how Japan's confidence shattered, and how the escort carriers, once dismissed as expendable, became immortal. The Japanese flagship Yamato opened fire first. Its 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, hurled shells the size of cars across the sea. Each one exploded with the force of a small building, sending up towering columns of water around the escort carriers. The little ships twisted and turned, their captains fighting to dodge death with every maneuver. The Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, all under relentless fire. But the Japanese gunners couldn't believe what they were seeing. These tiny carriers, barely armored and half their size, refused to die. Every time a carrier was hit, its crew fought fires, patched holes, and launched more planes. And the planes, they were everywhere. FM-2 Wildcats screamed in from every direction, strafing Japanese bridges and gun crews. TBM Avengers dove low to drop depth charges and torpedoes at impossible angles. The sky turned into a storm of smoke trails and explosions. Japanese ships were hit again and again, not by heavy bombers, but by sheer audacity. One by one, the escort destroyers charged straight into the line of battleships. USS Johnston, USS Howell, USS Samuel B. Roberts, names that would become legend. They launched torpedoes at point-blank range, trading their lives for every minute the carriers needed to escape. The Japanese commanders were stunned. Admiral Kurita, watching from the bridge of Yamato, couldn't believe the fury of the American defense. These weren't the mighty fleet carriers he expected. They were small, outgunned, practically defenseless. Yet they fought like an entire task force. By mid-morning, Kurita hesitated. He had sunk some ships, yes, but his fleet was taking unexpected damage. Smoke and confusion filled the sea. He began to suspect he was facing the entire American Third Fleet. What he didn't know, what no Japanese admiral could have imagined, was that he was retreating from a handful of escort carriers and destroyers, and sheer American resolve. When the guns finally fell silent off Samar, the ocean was littered with burning wrecks, drifting lifeboats, and oil-slicked water. The sea itself seemed stunned, as if unsure which side had truly won. Admiral Kurita, commanding Japan's center force, ordered his fleet to turn back. He had been moments away from destroying the American landing force at Leyte, a victory that could have reversed the tide of war. But in the chaos, he withdrew, convinced he had stumbled into a massive U.S. carrier task force. In reality, all that had stood between him and Leyte were 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, barely a fraction of a fleet. The Japanese had been outmaneuvered not by numbers, but by illusion, confusion, and sheer courage. Kurita's decision to retreat would go down as one of the most baffling and consequential moments of the Pacific War. For the men of Taffy 3, as the small task unit was called, it was both a miracle and a tragedy. They had fought with unimaginable bravery, their decks torn apart, their planes lost, their friends gone. Yet they had held the line against the might of the Imperial Navy. When the smoke cleared, 3 destroyers and 1 escort carrier lay at the bottom of the sea. Hundreds of sailors drifted for days before rescue came. But their stand had saved tens of thousands of troops ashore and sealed Japan's fate in the Philippines. Word of the battle spread quickly across the Pacific. Sailors whispered of the Taffy miracle, of baby flat tops that defied battleships, of men who charged giants, and of Japanese admirals who turned away in disbelief. Even the Japanese command, reviewing after-action reports, was humiliated. They realized too late that their grand fleet had been stopped not by superior firepower, but by what they once mocked as America's floating airstrips. In the weeks that followed the Battle off Samar, American naval engineers and strategists took a hard look at what the escort carriers had accomplished. They had not been designed for frontline combat. They were supposed to serve as logistical support, ferrying planes, patrolling convoy routes, and providing close air cover. But in the desperate crucible of the Pacific, they had proven something extraordinary. They showed that power did not have to come from size or speed, but from presence, persistence, and adaptability. Across the Pacific theater, escort carriers became indispensable. They supported amphibious assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, their aircraft flying thousands of sorties daily. They escorted supply convoys across shark-infested waters, fending off submarines and kamikaze attacks. And wherever they sailed, they multiplied the reach of the U.S. Navy, turning even the most remote corners of the ocean into launch pads for American air power. For Japan, their existence was an unsolvable problem. Each time one was sunk, another seemed to appear. By 1945, the United States had built over 120 escort carriers, more than the combined total of every major Navy's fleet in the world. They were produced faster than the enemy could count them, and they kept coming. Steel ghosts born from American industry. At Mitsubishi and Kure Naval Arsenal, Japanese engineers analyzed captured reports and intelligence photos. They could not comprehend how the U.S. could build ships at such scale, how steel, engines, and aircraft could flow endlessly from Detroit, Cleveland, and San Diego. To them, America's industrial capacity was as terrifying as its bombs. It meant that every ship lost today could be replaced tomorrow, bigger, stronger, faster. For the men who served on those small decks, the war left its scars. Many would later say they never forgot the smell of burning oil or the sound of aircraft engines roaring just feet above their heads. Yet there was pride, too, knowing that their tiny ships had defied the odds and changed the war's course. In Washington, naval strategists took note. The lessons of Leyte Gulf reshaped post-war doctrine. No longer would the aircraft carrier be seen merely as a capital ship. It would become the nucleus of all naval power, supported by smaller, flexible vessels capable of operating anywhere in the world. The baby flat tops, once mocked as auxiliary tools, had proved themselves as the decisive force of a new age of warfare, an era where air power ruled the seas. And in Japan's naval archives, one line stood out from a post-war report. "We underestimated the small ones. We thought them weak, until they showed us that, in war, even the smallest platform can cast the longest shadow." In the end, the escort carriers became more than ships. They became symbols. Symbols of an industrial democracy that had learned to fight not through grandeur, but through endurance. They were the embodiment of America's wartime philosophy: build more, adapt faster, and never stop moving. The Japanese had entered the war believing that mastery of the sea would belong to those with the largest guns, the thickest armor, and the most elite crews. But the battle off Samar shattered that illusion. Power, they discovered, could also come from the assembly line, from thousands of hands in distant factories, working in unison toward a single purpose. The escort carrier was a vessel born not from prestige, but from necessity. It was proof that even in the vastness of the Pacific, ingenuity could outmatch tradition. Each steel deck carried not only planes and pilots, but the weight of an entire nation's will to endure. In the decades that followed, their legacy endured quietly. Few stood in museums, few names were remembered. But every modern aircraft carrier, every deck that launches a jet into the sky, owes a part of its lineage to those humble ships that once fought under the call sign of Taffy. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the endless calm of the Pacific, one can almost imagine them still, small silhouettes against the rising sun, engines humming, crews ready, aircraft lined in perfect rows, tiny floating airstrips that once dared to stand against giants. Because history rarely remembers the biggest ships or the loudest guns. It remembers those who did the impossible with what little they had, and in doing so, changed the tide of war.